This is the new 31.5-inch True Black Glossy WOLED dual mode gaming monitor from ASUS. After having owned and reviewed a lot of OLED monitors, I can easily say this is the best looking OLED we've seen yet. I feel like for OLED image purists, this is probably the one you've been waiting for. I got to demo this at Computex back in May. Now I have it here in-house and it is absolutely gorgeous. There's two versions of this new glossy dual mode style and the main difference is refresh rate. This monitor does a dual mode of 165 Hz at 4K and 330 Hz at 1080p. It comes in priced at $999 for the US market with a 3-month promo period for certain retailers down to $899. North American availability on this is expected sometime in September. The other version does 240 Hz 4K, 480 Hz 1080p and comes priced at $1099. It will be available a little later in the year with no confirmed date as of yet. This faster version is the same panel from the already released PG32 UCDP dual mode, but it has the new True Black glossy coating. And the USB-C power delivery is now rated at only 15 watts versus 90 watts. So if you run your laptop docked to this monitor, you will still need to use your AC adapter, and that's the same on both versions. I just got the 240/480 version in-house, so all the measurements, etc. today will be based around the 165/330 version because I've spent a couple weeks with it. I will tell you which one I think is the better buy though at the end of the video. Being an XG line monitor, I love this simple stand versus the PG line stuff. I main a PG32 UCDM the majority of the time, and I keep it on an arm because that stand eats a lot of desk. This is just a flat base, really small footprint that's 9 inches at the widest point and less than 7 inches front to back. There is still lighting on the rear of the panel, but there's no lighting on the stand itself, and you get height, pivot, tilt, and just enough rotation to be able to level out the screen, but there's no full vertical rotation. You still have that threaded accessory mount on the top of the stand, and you do still get the included puck if you want to mount this on an arm instead. Get an external power brick, all your cables are in a zipper pouch, USB, DisplayPort 1.4, and a small microfiber cloth. For connections, we have USB-C 15 watt, 2 HDMI 2.1, and 1 DisplayPort 1.4. I've talked to death about whether you need DisplayPort 2.1, and the short answer is that for the overwhelming majority of users with the refresh rates and the resolutions that we have right now, you really don't. Running DSC, display stream compression, is virtually undetectable from a graphics standpoint. The thing that people get caught up on is that if you're running a game in exclusive full screen on the NVIDIA side and you Alt-Tab out of that, the screen can go black for up to like a second before it displays again. You can decide how much of a deal breaker that is for you. For audio, we do have a headphone jack here, but no speakers, and we also have the Auto KVM for handling multiple systems on the same set of peripherals. The star of the show here is definitely this new True Black glossy coating. We've seen one glossy WOLED from ASUS before, the gloss version of the 27-inch 240Hz 1440p OLED, the XG27AQ DMG. This looks noticeably better than that. Being glossy, this doesn't have the grain associated with matte coatings, and it holds better viewing angles without getting hazy. It also doesn't suffer the raised black issue that we find on QD OLEDs, where high levels of light in the room can cause the black to lift to like a purple color. The blacks here are a deep, inky black, and they hold that level even with a lot of ambient light in the room, and the reflections have been reduced. Reduced being the key word, mostly with ambient reflections. It's a big improvement, but you still do get really defined direct reflections. I mean, it's glossy. It's essentially a big black mirror, so avoid putting this somewhere where you have a light source, especially like a window shining directly onto the screen. Again, optically, this is the best of what I've seen so far in terms of image. It looks insane. There's no way the camera is going to do this thing justice. This is using LG's latest MLA Plus tech, so the brightness and SDR is very solid here. We're seeing full screen white of just under 265 nits. In practice, for OLEDs that get around this bright, I'll typically run these at about 40% in a dim to dark studio environment. I use Kalman Ultra to measure all these monitors, and the factory calibration here is impressive. For grayscale, absolute ideal Delta ITP variance is 3 or under. We're showing 3.76. That's very strong. Gamma, we're looking for 2.2 average, so we're essentially nailed there. Our white point should be 6500, and we're seeing 6134, so we're showing a touch red, but nothing that's really visible in usage. For factory calibration, the sRGB mode is looking strong, with an average Delta ITP color variance of only 5.5, and running wide gamut gives us a DCI P3 color coverage of 98%. That's very impressive. Like most of ASUS's recent monitors, you can tweak this thing till your heart's content, but I typically just run this in racing mode with wide color gamut mode on. Of course, being OLED, it's still going to have crazy fast gray to gray response time, still seeing sub 0.1 millisecond gray to gray with overshoot at like 0.3%. Outside of the visuals themselves, this is still one of the main reasons to go OLED versus other monitor tech. For motion blur, here's what we're looking like at 165 Hz in the 4K mode. As your refresh goes up, so does your motion blur performance, but this is solid at this refresh rate. We also do have ELMB here on this monitor. This helps to reduce motion blur further, but remember there's some really important differences here in how this works versus backlight strobing on an LCD panel. Because there is no backlight on OLED, we're going to be inserting a black frame in between the frames. A black frame insertion comes with two major drawbacks. One, you have to run half of your monitor's max refresh rate, so So in the 4K 165 example, the max for us would be 82 Hz, and 2, it substantially impacts brightness. Here's what running 82 Hz looks like without ELMB, and here's what it looks like with it on. It makes a huge difference to motion blur running at that speed, but when you compare it to just running 165, the 165 still looks better to my eye. So ELMB offers no improvement to the 165 Hz mode. You would opt to use this mode when your game can't reliably, consistently hit 165 Hz, which when you're talking about 4K modern titles with the details all cranked up is most of those. The exact same thing holds true when you're running at 330 Hz 1080p mode. So for the best motion blur, you'll need to figure out what your game can handle starting at 165 and then work your way down. I do think the ELMB numbers make more sense on the faster version because halved you'd be running either 120 or 240, and those are both strong frame rates for single player and competitive multiplayer respectively if you can't max out the 240 480. And when I say ELMB hits brightness, it basically halves it. We're talking 265 all the way down to like 132 nits, so you'll have to judge whether your room can sustain that or if it's going to be bright enough for you. It's important to note too that a lot of things have to be turned off to run ELMB, including HDR, and on this version 120 Hz output. So on the console side, this may be something you can use with older titles, but for more modern stuff, the 120 Hz and HDR experience is going to be the way to go. Good input latency performance here too. At 165 Hz we see 3.4 milliseconds against a theoretical perfect of 3, and at 330 Hz we've got 2.1 against a perfect Theo of 1.5. Unfortunately, this monitor does exhibit VRR flicker in both the 165 Hz and the 330 Hz mode. I see this both in my testing app and in game, and we did receive a firmware update during the course of this review, and that did not correct the issue. So despite this monitor having an OLED anti-flicker feature that restricts the range of the variable refresh rate, I didn't find either setting to be effective in either mode. For dual mode operation, we've got a hotkey on the back that doesn't automatically toggle, it just brings up a dedicated menu to toggle. That seems like something they could shave a step from. Understand that gaming in 1080p 330 Hz is going to be soft at full screen. I can't say blurry because that's too aggressive a word for what it is. It's just a soft focus when you're displaying 1080p on a native 4K screen at 32 inches. 1080p goes into 4K or UHD exactly 4 times, so theoretically we're using groups of 4 pixels to represent 1. So there's a lack of pixel density there, but there is still good clean scaling math. And we've got aspect ratio control here too, so you can simulate a few different sizes of aspect ratios and screen sizes. There are square and stretch modes if you want to run 4:3, but the two most common ways people will use this is in 16:9, running either a simulated 27-inch or a 24.5 for competitive FPS. I criticized LG's dual mode last year for the way that it handled pixel scaling in these modes. 27-inch was okay, 24-inch was a no-go. Unfortunately, I don't have that monitor anymore. I had to send that back, and I hate trying to go off memory in reviews, but I really can't remember how that LG monitor handled scaling. The reason that's important is because these simulated modes don't seem to bother me nearly as much here. How this works is we have a certain amount of physical pixels on the panel, so reducing the dimension where we're displaying an image is reducing the amount of physical pixels we have access to. Safe to assume in the 24.5-inch mode we're using 1496 across by 848 high because that's the recommended resolution in Windows when we're in this mode. 1080p is 1920 by 1080, so if you were to try to take that frame and mush that down into the physical dimensions that we have available here, it would look really bad because we'd have a scaling rate of 1.35 to 1. You can't make 0.35 of a pixel display something different than the rest of the pixel, but Windows isn't trying to do that here, and neither is COD. The game itself is also outputting at 1496 by 848, and that's what I can't remember about the LG, if it's doing it like this or if it's trying to fit all that 1080p down into a smaller physical pixel real estate. That 24-inch mode on the LG caused me eye strain. It felt like my eyes were constantly trying to focus on the screen, and I don't get that same feeling here. I'm not going to say this looks great, but it looks good as a secondary mode, and it doesn't make my eyes hurt. The 27-inch mode looks even a little better to me. If you sit in Pixel Peep, of course you're going to notice stuff, but if you're locked in, especially with a hectic arena type shooter, that all just kind of goes away. The stand here again is a champ because you can really tuck this thing in close when you're running one of these aspect modes. So running this panel primarily in 4K, but then being able to switch over to one of these modes at 330 Hz for competitive FPS, yes, I would absolutely daily something like this. Text clarity, icons, web browsing at 1080p, no, but why would you? It should go without saying at this point, but the 4K experience here is absolutely top tier and the HDR is super dialed in. There's two primary modes worth using for me. Display HDR 400 mode, which is going to top out right about 400 nits, and then HDR console, where I measured the peak brightness at a max of 775 all the way to a 10% window. There is a mode called adjustable HDR that does provide over 1000 nits peak at 1 and 2%, but I don't recommend using this mode because the EOTF and luminance tracking is skewed, which the monitor does warn you about. The other two modes are both super accurate, so I would default to console HDR, which will give you higher peak brightness without really sacrificing anything. Subjectively, while we're not hitting 1000 1000 nit peak brightness in a well-tuned mode like on the PG32 UCDM, we're not super far off, and the experience here is still very solid. Coupled with the true black glossy coating, I just can't say enough about how good this monitor looks. Asus just seems to keep stacking more and more burn-in protection into their monitors, and this one has the most I've seen yet. This already has the full suite of dimming and shifting tech and scheduled pixel cleaning we expect to see from Asus, but they've also introduced the Neo proximity sensor. You can set this to a predetermined range and dial in a custom setting, and when you get up and leave from the desk, your monitor will automatically go to black after a preset amount of time. As somebody who's easily distracted, gets up and leaves their monitor running all the time, this is great for me. We also have their usual huge heatsink on the back, and it is a fanless design. Asus really leads the league in preventing burn-in, and all their OLED monitors include a 3-year warranty with specific protection for burn-in. I've said it before, but as time goes on, I just get less and less concerned about burn-in. I'm now 100% OLED on all of my setups, and I don't even really feel like I've seen any complaint threads out there in the wild since OLED's been out now for a bit. And just a bit on text clarity. If you're running this in 4K for productivity, which you really should be, it's basically a non-issue. This panel uses the latest LG Pixel layout, the RGWB. This is an 11-point font at 200% scaling in 4K. This looks perfectly fine to me, and we don't get that green-purple edge shimmer we usually see on QD-OLED. There is a clear edge function in here for text, but I really don't find it makes a difference either way. All right, let's run this down. This coating provides an image that is visually the best I've seen so far from OLED, and that's not a low bar. 165 is a decent frame rate for 4K. 330 is more than enough for a decent competitive experience. The high refresh 1080p mode combined with the aspect ratio doesn't give you the same level of clarity or motion blur performance you'd get in a dedicated esports TN panel, but as a secondary mode to a banger 4K experience, it's more than usable. Especially if you're someone who's always searching for that single monitor experience, and you get the color, contrast, and response time benefits of going OLED. For as long as people usually keep their monitors, spending the extra $200 for the faster version makes a lot of sense to me here, as long as you have the budget and the machine to push it. But because that faster refresh rate is really the only difference here, if you can't stretch that extra $200, you're still getting everything else that makes this monitor so good. Like most of their monitors, this thing is just packed with modes, features, and options. Like ELMB, you're really only going to use that in specific use cases, but it's great to have the option there. Text looks good, anti-burn-in tech is very full-featured, stand design is top tier, even though I'll probably be putting this back on an ARM. I've primarily mained the PG32 UCDM since it came out a year and a half ago. That and the Gigabyte Aorus FO32 U2P are the only 32-inch 4K OLEDs I've consistently recommended to people. Occasionally I'll switch out for the Asus 27-inch 480Hz 1440p if I'm feeling really sweaty, but I've always been in love with the possibility of just running one single monitor on my gaming desk. While the PG32 UCDM has the best HDR tuning I've seen out there at 1000 nits peak brightness, I think that monitor has finally been outmatched for me. Thanks to the way this monitor handles the combination of the high refresh mode and the aspect ratios and the insanely good looking coating, I'm gonna be running this full time. The faster version. I would probably still pick the 165/330 version over the faster PG32 UCDM because of the dual mode. As long as the room is dim or dark, they look very similar. With the 240/480 version though, there's only upsides versus the UCDM. And that'll be my main until we see a high refresh 4K 1440p dual mode. I don't even know if that's possible, but I guess that's my new dream spec. And that's it for today. Thanks so much for watching. I will catch you all in the next one. Stay up.